Alright, congratulations, you've made it to the last video for Unit 1. Today we're going to talk about the origins of life on Earth. Alright, this is also going to include a little bit of 7.12, variations in populations, but I would go to videos 7.4 and 7.5, which is where I talked a lot about variations in populations, because it just seemed to fit better within that context. So you can go back and check out that video. That's talking about different ways that populations change over time. But specifically for today, 7.13, Origins of Life on Earth, you are going to describe the scientific evidence that supports models, or that provides support for models of the origin of life on Earth. All right, here are your notes that are provided in your unit notes packet. That's going to be on the oxygen page. You can download that. You can work on these questions after the video, and they will be helpful as you are guided through this topic. This one has 2 pages, and then our last one, this is just 7.13, and it also has 2 pages. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so the origin of life. Now, this is kind of a touchy subject in the Christian community, but I just want to preface this with a statement saying this isn't necessarily cut and dry exactly how I understand the origins of life to be. However, in AP Biology, you are expected to understand the evidence provided that says that this is a model of the origin of life on Earth. Now, how does that fit in with Scripture? That's a way bigger conversation, one that I would be happy to have with you. With what do we do with these pieces of evidence, and what do we also do with the Bible saying, and the perspective of 7-day creationism? There's a much wider spectrum there, okay? And it's not something that I would intend to cover right now. So this is just, if you would like to have that conversation with me, I would be more than happy to. But right now, I'm going to expose you to several hypotheses about the origin of life and the evidence that supports them, okay? So we're looking at 3 different kinds of evidence, all right? So first, we're going to look at geological evidence. Second, we're going to look at chemical evidence. And finally, we're going to look at molecular evidence. All right, and these all support several different models of the origins of life on Earth. All right, so the big question then is, how did life arise? One proposed idea is that early Earth contained inorganic molecules that could have eventually synthesized organic molecules due to 2 things: free energy and abundant oxygen. All right, there are several pieces of evidence that back this up, and we're going to touch on those. But another idea is that organic molecules could have also been transported to Earth via meteorites or other celestial events. So either they could have been synthesized here on Earth, or they were transported to Earth. All right, so we're going to look at different evidence that supports those 2 models. Using absolute and relative dating, we have determined that the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years ago. All right, that's the most commonly accepted amount of time today. Where do we get that evidence? All right, we use fossil evidence, okay, to determine that the early Earth was not suitable for life until about 3.9 billion years ago. We don't see any fossils around until that time. All right, the earliest fossil evidence is about 3.5 billion years ago. And these bacterial fossils are called stromatolites. All right, stromatolites, here's a picture of stromatolites, actually. These are cyanobacteria, fossilized, and this is the first time that we see life arise on Earth. Now, what happened between this 3.9 and 3.5 billion years? We do see that there is evidence of life around this time, but it's not fossil evidence. We're going to talk about that evidence here in a second. All right, so here's kind of a map or a timeline of the history of the Earth, and I'm going to kind of walk you through this. You don't need to memorize any of this, okay? This is just for your reference. But here we have the Hadean era, and this is the time before we have fossil records of life. So this is kind of, Hades, hot, really, really hot Earth. And this is the time where, from this time, about 4.5 billion years ago to 4 billion years ago when it ended, we first see life happening at the end of this Hadean era, okay? However, we do have a really long period of time until photosynthetic organisms are found on Earth, around 3.5 billion years ago, okay? Now, why is that? What's happening between here and here? Okay, we know that that organisms need oxygen, okay? Photosynthesis results in the production of oxygen. So here we have a really, really vast increase of oxygen on Earth, okay? So as oxygen becomes more enriched in the atmosphere, life is going to continue to evolve, but it's going from just small and microscopic to finally we have more multicellular organisms arise. And it's going to continue this way for a really long time, okay? And now we end up with the entrance of eukaryotes on Earth. We have multicellular life here. And then finally we get animals. Okay, this is where we have the Cambrian. Around here is when we have the Cambrian explosion, the very rapid evolution of organisms, and then land plants, mammals, and humans are just this very, very small portion right here. So when we're looking at the history of Earth, humans exist only for a teeny little thumbnail of it, okay? Now, like I said earlier, 3.9 billion years ago is when we see the first evidence of life, and this is coming from chemical evidence, all right? Two scientists, Oparin and Haldane, hypothesized that Earth was primarily composed of hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and water at that time, around 3.9 billion years ago. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, they came up with an experiment that tested their hypothesis in their lab. Okay, so they simulated this atmosphere in their lab, and they found that organic compounds and amino acids actually formed from these four components. And so that they hypothesized, based on that experiment, Miller and Urey, using their Miller and Urey experiment, which is what it's famously called now, that these organic molecules that serve as the building blocks for macromolecules, which we will talk about next unit. All right, so what's the significance of this? This is evidence that tells us that the early Earth's atmosphere was capable of producing amino acids, the building blocks of life, from inorganic substances, which is very significant in supporting the origin of life hypothesis. Finally, we're going to look at molecular evidence. Okay, we look often at homologous molecules for molecular evidence, which we talked about in video 7.6, 7.7, which is evidence for evolution. But this idea that there are molecules that are all homologous, or structures similar among all living organisms. And this is where we bring in the idea of the last universal ancestor, or LUCA, last universal common ancestor, you might hear it called, common ancestor. And this last common ancestor all utilized these common molecules: DNA, RNA, proteins, ATP, that's bad, lipid membranes, a bilipid membrane, and cell division as the basic components of living things that they all use together, okay? So this is what we would call the last universal common ancestor. And this ancestor was now accepted to be a single-cell bacterium-like organism, and it's estimated to have lived about 4 billion years ago. So this was when Earth was only 560 million years old, so around 4 billion years ago, right? When we're having oxygen enriched on Earth. And this is going to, in this evidence of the LUCA, or last common ancestor, this little microbe has come from typically phylogenetics. So we've looked at sequencing genomes and have constructed this vast genetic library that allows scientists to piece together this last universal common ancestor that forms the base of our tree. Okay, we have archaea, bacteria, and eukaryotes, all right, kind of in the middle there, right? So then LUCA would have been this common ancestor at the beginning, all right? And we also need to touch on this RNA world hypothesis. This is a hypothesis developed in the 1960s that says that RNA could have been the earliest genetic material, all right? So the ribosome, which is a molecular complex that assembles proteins, it's made up of both RNA and protein components, and typically we think of enzymes or a form of protein to catalyze reactions, but actually in ribosomes, reactions are catalyzed by RNA. So this supports this idea that RNA could have been the earliest genetic material to catalyze reactions that would then lead to the building blocks of life. So this helps to explain the pre-cellular stages of life in providing evidence for the origins of life on Earth. All right, so I would like you to think back to when we covered the endosymbiont theory. This is going to be in your 7.4, 7.5 video, all right, the endosymbiotic theory. How does this relate to the topic of origins of life? I would like you to think back on that, and you can answer your questions. Check your answers on PowerSchool for your unit notes to help you kind of gather some of the content for this topic, but that should be all for today. Thanks for listening. Congratulations, you've made it through the content of your first unit.